Welcome to another episode of Into Zimbabwe, an edition brought to you by the Zimbabwe Human Rights Matters platform or Protect Defenders in partnership with the National Association of Youth Organizations. And today we'll be discussing the Private Voluntary Organizations Bill and its impact on civic organizations and the civic space in general. And to discuss this topic today, I'm joined by the Male Manager from National Association of Youth Organizations, Mr. MacDonald Munyoro, and the Director of Protect Defenders, Mr. Gwenzi. Gentlemen, meet the viewers.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us on the show.
The pleasure is all mine. So, to get down into the discussion, Civicus has characterized the civic space as a group of civic organizations, activists, trade unions, and any other not-for-profit organization working to advance public life. And the World Bank has also capitalized on this as the space that which allows people to communicate and exchange ideas without any threat to influence social, structural, and economic change. And in most cases, Civicus has actually rated Zimbabwe's civic space as restricted, and it has used the index that measures from open, narrow, restricted, and obscured. And here today, Zimbabwe is actually measured as restricted. So to get into it, in fact, what is your general perspective, or what is your reaction to the status quo in Zimbabwe?
Thank you very much. Civic space is cardinal to the work that civil society organizations do in Zimbabwe. We are well aware that whilst we've got section 13 and 14 of the Constitution that talk about national development and the need for citizen participation and involvement, and whilst we even have the government that is provincial and district structures, it receives a lot of complementarity from non-state actors, or from what we commonly know as civil society organizations or non-governmental organizations who complement the different interventions that the government does. So civil society organizations find themselves within the public domain, where they are an interlocutor between the government and the citizens. Where, for instance, civil society can question the government to say, community X has not had water for 3 months. Can we have a conversation? Can we have commitments towards ensuring that community X has more access to water? Beyond holding the government to account, you also understand that civil society organizations or NGOs in Zimbabwe have also complemented the efforts of the government to deliver on social and economic goods. We are currently coming from COVID-19. Before that, we mostly talked of poverty in the rural areas. But in the aftermath of COVID-19, we talk of urban poverty. We have so many interventions that are being done by civil society organizations, by NGOs, to assist households that have since fallen into the cracks of poverty on account of COVID-19. So it finds that civil society organizations do a lot of work to complement the efforts of government. And when we see an institution as reputable as the Civicus Monitor now ranking and saying that the space in our country is repressed, and when they say repressed, it means we're just one step from where the space is closed. So what that means is that there are serious limitations that have been placed on the exercise of the freedoms and the rights to association. And with the right to association, we are saying it's the right that allows people to come together and say we're going to be people B, and because of people B, we're going to defend young people that are failing to access education and provide services A, B, C, and D for them to access education. So you find that in the context of that, it then means that the work that NGOs do has become very, very difficult. And I think in terms of the nitty-gritties of the operating environment, I'm sure someone would also maybe tease a little bit into that. But you'd find that in the current context that we are in, it simply means that if the context is repressed, it is very difficult for non-state actors, which include civil society organizations, to organize and implement their programs effectively.
Okay. So, Sam, I think I'll swing the same question to you and a bit of an extension on what Magdi has said in terms of the work of civic organizations and its importance.
Yeah, I think there's a correlationship between government and the civic space in order to provide developmental goods to the people. So I think there's need of that complementary to be cultivated. Basically, what the report from Civicus and other actors like World Bank in terms of ranking the country, it shows that there is a gap which I think as citizens of this country, collectively we need to sit down and ensure that we cultivate that ground and produce the results that we want to open that particular civic space. And I think the idea that has been there is for the government and the civic actors to find each other in the processes. Of course, we have got processes that have already been put across through some legislative approaches, some of them probably that we may discuss in detail soon. But there are also some processes that happens between relative ministries that sees the space of civic actors and also the donor community and donor agencies and the international community. So I think there is now need to have that big balance of having a good conversation among the various players that needs to see development and see how best we can open the already shrinking civic space as provided by these international institutions that have ranked our country below in terms of civic participation.
Okay, so much about civic participation, I think, borders around freedom of association. So I would like to know, what is the importance of freedom of association, especially in the civic space?
Yeah, freedom of association is one critical element, because freedom of association gets on into the Bill of Rights, which is there within the Constitution of Zimbabwe. And I think it now borders in how some legislative enactment are able to provide that, whether it's within the electoral context, whether it's within the donor work, whether it's within the civic or within government or intergovernmental engagements. So the aspect of the freedom of association needs to be looked in that respect. Even within the academic space, there is need to have proper platforms where academics are able to express themselves and able to push whatever that they need to push. It may be within the media, where there's that aspect of freedom to attend any particular fora, even political or religious or social, despite the different ideological spaces in the country. So I think the freedom of assembly borders more within our constitution to give those particular rights. But sometimes we have had some different challenges that has been happening of late. But I think there is now that bigger opportunity in the country to start again. And I think these platforms and engagement that have been provided by such spaces gives us an opportunity to converse on what is it that is freedom of assembly. Are we using it, or we are abusing that particular freedoms? So those are the questions that we need to discuss so that there is a balance. Because sometimes there is a legitimate reason to curtail some freedom of assembly, especially if it has got connotation that restrict or that affect the broader members of society. So in some cases, there's the need of a balance. But also there's also an element where the state abuses its powers to restrict that particular space, either for their own political gains. So we now need to have a proper balance to ensure that our freedoms are exercised in full, but also with pure caution of respecting other people's freedoms.
Okay, so it also comes back now to, civic or NGO governmental relations, especially with the lines of freedom of association. Because far too many times we've seen NGOs being labeled as being aligned to opposition parties. But then we want to know, how then does that impact the work of CSOs, especially in Zimbabwe?
I mean, civil society organizations are recognized as independent development organizations. What it simply means is that at face value, a civil society organization is not a political entity. By nature, it's not supposed to be partisan. When civil society organizations are put together, they pursue specific social objectives. They aim to deliver specific economic, social, cultural, political, you name it, goods for the benefit of the citizens. So, I mean, when we come to narrations that label civil society as being part of a regime change agenda, I think for me, we lose sight of the importance of civil society organizations. We're talking about Agenda 2030, Sustainable Development Goals, leaving no one behind. You'd find that civil society organizations have a very, very critical role to play towards those 10 goals that were prioritized by the government that we're supposed to be doing in Zimbabwe. So I think for me, these are issues that go back, I think, to what someone was speaking to say that the civic space must be balanced in such a way that the freedoms to association are upheld, whilst at the same time, we also have a human eye to say that as these rights are exercised, it must also not infringe on the rights of others. And I think when we begin to label civil society using such words, we are also beginning to infringe on the rights and space that civil society should traditionally exist and function under.
Well, that's quite interesting insights. And now, it then comes to the Istanbul's principles that set a local, in fact, an international standard. In fact, it's a global standard for how civic organizations should operate. And to what extent then are they being followed by local civic organizations in Zimbabwe?
So the Istanbul principles, like you've said, it's a global standard that tries to provide a basis on which to measure the effectiveness of the work of civil society organizations or NGOs to development work. And these Istanbul principles, there are 8 of them. There's a principle around transparency and accountability, where we are saying that in the work that we do as civil society organizations, we must promote, we must encourage, we must be transparent and accountable to our stakeholders, to our communities, to our donors, even to the government. More importantly, within the Istanbul principles, we also talk about issues of environmental sustainability, we talk about issues of gender equity, equality, we also talk about issues that have to do with us as civil society organizations using the human rights-based approach to say that in the work that we do, we must apply the do no harm approach, where if an intervention is going to be structured by an organization, it must not infringe on the rights of other local citizens. So the principles are there to sort of like give us a basis on which we do our work and go to any global platform in the world where people talk about the work of civil society. The basis of measuring what we are doing are the Istanbul principles. And I think in the last study that we did in 2022, that tried to look at the application of the IPs in Zimbabwe, you'd find that most organizations do not really know that what they are doing is part of the Istanbul principles, but you'd find that most of them in their programming, they reflect the different 8 principles of the IPs. But then I think what we need within Zimbabwean civil society is to have more open conversations around the Istanbul principles to say, what are they? When an organization you are said to be applying each of the 8 principles, what does that mean? And I hope that in other sessions of this particular program, we can even try to dig a little bit into how that implementation could be improved at the national level.
Okay. So, Sam, in line with following the Istanbul principles, particularly NGO accountability, what's your assessment of NGO accountability in Zimbabwe?
Yeah, I think what has been lacking is the aspect of accountability. Whom do you account to, and how do you account? Because I think that has been also one of the factors in the new legislative approach that the government has brought about, especially on the PVO bill, to say how is the NGOs accountable to anyone? Are you accountable to the government? Are you accountable to the citizens? Whom are you accountable to? Was at the end of the day when civic actors propose probably policy positions, they either has to go to specifically to government in order to change certain policy stuff. They also need to go to citizens to fully appreciate and understand certain policy that may be developmental to their agenda within the civic space. So there's that aspect which is within the Istanbul principles, the accountability aspect, that the civic space also need to be accountable. Also, much of our organization has been operating probably with the membership in their constitution through those trusts or measured in another existence. But the aspect of accountability still hangs in the balance, as probably individuals operate in isolation, either as briefcase institutions or probably some elements that may be propounded by governments to say that they are building a basis for terrorism and other elements, which in some cases may be wrong. But now the question is, I think as civic actors, the aspect of accountability needs to come to terms to say, how do we address transparency within ourselves? Because in many circumstances, general council meetings, especially with membership-based organization, they may not provide that particular basis. People may not break down to understand the audit, the financial audit of an institution in some instances. So if there are measurable areas to say, if we do such elements 1, 2, 3, this constitutes an institution that brings about accountability. So accountability needs to be also in actual space. But also, there are also fears currently in terms of accountability of the civic space, especially in terms of government, with the current elements that has been provided in the legislative approach of the PVO bill, to have more than enough interference by the executive, where the minister have got like excess powers. So I think there's now need to have that kind of engagement to say, in terms of accountability and involvement of actors, whether our donors or back donors, or it may be the government, what level of influence are they supposed to have within the operational framework of civic organizations?
Okay. So now that Sam has already preemptively went into the private voluntary organizations bill, in Zimbabwe right now, the private voluntary organizations bill amendment actually went through to the House of Assembly and to the Senate, and it now awaits presidential assent. So what are the feelings in terms of how it shapes the operating terrain for CSOs, and how does it affect CSOs themselves as institutions?
I think just before diving into that, I just want to speak a bit on CSO accountability, to take a bit from what someone has said, to say that, remember earlier when I said we are independent development actors, it means that we have a role to play when it comes to development. And in the manner that civil society organizations function in Zimbabwe, they have had different sets of practices around accountability. To some it has been to the donor, to some it has been to the government, to some it has been to the community, to some it has been to the internal structures of that particular organization. But you'd also find that in the domain of improving accountability, there is also a lot that we could do. A very good starting point could be around the Istanbul principles. It can be an instrument of trying to measure how accountable we are by improving our effectiveness in the work that we do as civil society organizations. But like also what someone has said, it's a conversation that we need to scale up, to reflect on those practices and say, in the context of some of the new nuances that are coming up, as civil society organizations, who ultimately are we accountable to? Because that question is not answered in black and white. Then coming to the private voluntary organizations amendment bill, It was specifically put together for 3 primary reasons. The first one is around the FATF Recommendation 8 that tries to address issues of money laundering and terrorist financing that goes to the non-profit sector. It's also about stopping civil society organizations or NGOs from engaging in political lobbying activities. And it's also about trying to regularize and improve the registration of NGOs in Zimbabwe. And I think reading on paper, I mean, regulation is not really problematic, but the formula of regulation, when it becomes problematic, it means that as civil society, we begin to react in a certain way. And I think when you look at the PVO Amendment Bill, in the state in which it went through, the stages that you've given reference to, you'd find that it's going to place very serious limitations on the freedom of association. Because if you are a trust, it's going to mean that you won't receive financing. And in the absence of financing, at times it is also very critical, very difficult for an NGO to function. In 2021 alone, I think according to the report that was given by the Minister of Finance, you'd find that NGOs brought into the country about $957 million as free funds. And we all know how important foreign currency is to our development trajectory as a country. That's close to $1 billion annually. When we shut down these NGOs, what does that mean to those people that survived on that billion, either as social, economic, or whatever goods, either as people that are part of the value chain of what these NGOs are doing, or even those that are employed in the sector. More importantly, you also find that the current bill that is proposed, that is awaiting presidential assent, also gives a lot of powers and rooms to the private voluntary organizations board, to the minister, in terms of interfering in the day-to-day work. You can imagine as an organization, you've got your board, you are told your board is now defunct, but you have a board that is put for up to 60 days, 2 months, running and governing how an institution operates. So you find that there are many things that the private voluntary organizations amendment bill is going to bring. And for some in the immediate term, it might mean that they won't be able to operate. It means many are going to close. What does that mean to communities, to villages, to homes, to constituencies that depended on the social and economic goods that were being supplied by these civil society organizations? And I think with where we are, it leaves civil society in a very precarious position where it has been enabled fairly by the state. But at the same time, there is a law that is coming that would change significantly how civil society organizations have functioned in the public domain. And from where we stand, it's a situation, I think for me, if you were to ask me, that speaks of a house that is on fire. We must begin to think creatively and innovatively, but also diplomatically and openly, to say that how can we salvage the current situation that we are in, to ensure that we allow civil society organizations to continue to deliver the significant work that they've always done towards meeting the development aspirations of Zimbabwe as a country.
Okay. So I'm sure I will take turns to respond to this one. I remember earlier I touched on the Civicus measuring index of our civic space, and it says that we are restricted, and as you said, we are one step to a closed space. So what could be primarily the cause of that?
Well, civil society organizations have always functioned in very difficult contexts. If you look at us, Zimbabwe, from independence, and you try to look at the different epochs of civil society, I don't think any of them ever existed in a space where the space was considered to be open. But we have many years that we can celebrate, that we can talk about a functional, that we can talk about a pragmatic civil society that is in Zimbabwe. And I think what that says to us is, it's not the end of the road. Because ultimately we do not even know if it's going to go to the next step. Even if it does, it simply means that as civil society organizations, we need to be innovative, we need to co-create strategies that will still help us to address some of the initial thinking that brought us here. One of the issues I think that has been raised against civil society is around accountability. Imagine what would significantly change if we were to openly put on the table and say, this is how we're going to be accountable as a sector. It can help us to solve the kind of situation that we are in. And I'm saying this on account of things that we have the power to control. Because when the government comes and puts a blanket cover to say civil society is regime change, not everyone is. How do we even know that this one is and this one is not? Because ultimately, like I said earlier on, we are interlocutors between the government, between the citizens. And all we are there to strengthen is the relationship between the duty bearer and the rights holder to ensure that all access services that are within the confines of the law in our own country.
Okay. So, a shrinking or a restricted civic space, what could be the cause?
Yeah, there are a lot of issues. Probably the restriction may happen because the government may fear the people. So it's maybe one other reason. Then secondly, it may be that probably in the past we have been having unfettered freedoms, which has been also been abused in any case. And probably when those kind of freedoms are being taken away, we feel the space is being closed. So it's a different way, which has to come like from different actors to say what is there for. But I think there's a history of the closure of the civic space. Sometime in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, there's that NGO bill during Mugabe's era, which was also in line with over-regulation of the civic space. Then currently in the new dispensation, we have got the PVO bill, which is also in any case being seen as restrictive. So there are a lot of elements that are there, and there are some justifications in order to bring these some legislative that are considered repressive within the civic space. But right now, like what my colleague has said, that we now need to be creative enough, because I think this existence of gaps, it speaks volumes to a divided house within the civic space. So the very first question is to bring about civic actors to say, comrades, let's come on the table. What kind of civic space do we envision in the very first space? And how do we ensure, probably using the standards of the Istanbul principles, to say these are kind of elements that we would want to see in our kind of engagement. Then from there, we also have to get on, because if we are united in our different contexts, youth, labor, students movements, and NGOs and other civic human rights organizations and stuff, and say, this is what we want. So I think what we also need is leadership and the ability to converse as actors within the particular civic space and define what kind of civic organization do we want to be seen as Zimbabweans, to have the Zimbabwean context of a civic space, not some elements that we may get from others. Then probably looking to the history that we have. So there's that aspect of repressive in contexts where the government wants to consolidate power. And in any case, it will want to control critical actors, especially those that are more critical to their work. So there are those kind of elements. But I think there's also an opportunity in the thick of darkness to say, let's now come back and say, this is what we want. And I think that's where probably the questions that we now need to focus on as different actors to define the civic space context of our Zimbabwean context. Yeah.
Okay. So, some board reports and corners of scholarly views have actually cited that there is a lot of democratic backsliding, especially in the post-Cold War era of politics. Even the USA Civic has said the civic space is obscured. We have seen it with police brutality, racial injustices. In South Africa, the case is the same. You see the passing of legislation similar to the PVO bill, or with similar acts of the PVO bill, like the patriotic bill itself. And do you think that the restricted nature or the restricted levels of our civic space can be owed to democratic backsliding?
Yeah, in some way, I think the right has taken over the space, looking even with considered pro-democratic countries. They have also been going down in terms of democratic values. So yeah, there may be democratic backsliding, or probably we, as Zimbabweans, we now need to return back to some key values, because I think the civic space is anchored within the liberation echoes, where we were fighting for freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. So probably we now need to rethink back to say, comrades, we have been fighting for these liberation values: the right to expression, the right to one man, one vote, the right to media, transparent accountability, equity, which are clear liberation values. So probably if we frame in such aspect to the ruling party, which brought about the kind of independence that we have today, and say, comrades, I think we need to rethink of the Zimbabwe we want. The Zimbabwe that respect the rights to accountability, to freedom of expression, to freedom of assembly, and all those kind of a Bill of Rights. Then probably we may have a buy-in in some way, in another way, not probably the kind of confrontation that happens in some of our spaces, to say we see it's a black and white between the civic actors and the government. So also those are kind of the elements that we also need to deal with in terms of having a Zimbabwe we want, and a Zimbabwe that respect the civic space.
Okay. Yeah. So, MacDonald, do you think that the current state of our civic space is owed to democratic backsliding?
I mean, the world has seen a decline in democratic practices in the wake of COVID-19, where this was done in the context of public health emergencies. But you'd find that, yes, the lockdowns, but you'd find that in the aftermath of that, some countries have continued to place some of those restrictive measures, even when the COVID-19 pandemic curve has significantly gone down. And of course, that has had a very adverse effect on the civics or on the public in terms of how they would normally relate, organize, speak, try to communicate to the government their aspiration or their thinking. And I think whilst we're also even having this conversation, you'd also find that at some point with the coming in of MOPA, which also tries to speak to how the freedom of association, assembly is exercised in the country. You'd find that whilst we'd hoped that the law would come in a progressive manner, it came again to sort of like put measures to how as citizens we can function within the public domain, to an extent that it has become very difficult for people to try and communicate to their government an issue or a concern. Yet we are saying that the function of some of these freedoms is to allow for a level of interaction between the duty bearer and the rights holder, the government and the citizen at the end of the day. So So this trend is happening world over. I think according to the Civicus Monitor, close to 42% of the world lives in conditions that are considered to be replaced and closed. Yeah. So it's a worrying state of affairs in the world, but I think it does not mean that it's the end of the road for all the actors that we find within the public domain.
Okay. Then also, I think we try to avoid being lethargic or defeatist per se. There is always also another side of the story. And one, I think in the Zimbabwean case, one is of resilience. If I am to recall it well, 21st century civil society goes as early as 1999, 1995, your crisis in Zimbabwe coalitions, your ZCTUs. In fact, ZCTU is one of the oldest civic movements, you know. You have had activists come and go, some even joining the political space. What could be the key factor that has enabled Zimbabwean civil society to be so resilient?
I mean, we are there as civil society to deliver on social objectives. When it becomes difficult to do our work, it's a choice to choose between cutting off those list of beneficiaries or constituencies that you're serving, or trying to be innovative and creative to allow you to still deliver the same goods that you're supplying to that particular group. And I think for me, civil society organizations have stood with the people. They've stood with their constituencies. And I think for me, it is on the basis, especially now where we've got a new constitution, of how we understand the Zimbabwe that is envisioned through the constitution. A careful and close reading of the preamble will tell you of where the country came from, what the country has embraced, and where it needs to go. And I think cumulatively as civil society, our work is within the confines of what the constitution says, to say that can we pursue the equitable and fair Zimbabwe that allows all of us to thrive, and in the presence of challenges and difficulties, can we come together and try and solve those problems? And civil society has been there as part and parcel of providing some of the solutions to these problems, whether they are issues of service delivery, whether they are issues of humanitarian support within communities, whether they are issues of ensuring that citizens are empowered to know their rights and to engage with their local leaders.
Okay. Sam, what could be the key factor to acknowledge behind Zimbabwean civil society's resilience today?
Yeah, I think the mandate of civic society, like my colleague has said, is clear, is to serve the purpose of the developmental agenda, to uplift the lives of people, but also it also serves as the voice of the people in terms of, especially when the civic space, like in our context, when you consider it restricted, the civic are the ones that become that particular voice. So I think that's where the resilience also comes on board. I think it's about conviction more than just the mere work. And I think most of the people that are within the civic space is also about the calling to say, I am called to serve my community, I'm called to serve my country, and that one is the driving power, especially for some, because in any case, even the space is restricted. The media personnel do their duty, despite some challenges of either a skewed judiciary in some cases, what other people say, or a skewed police in some cases, what they say, but the media always are able to report freely, openly, and in some cases, even with the challenges that is there. Then also the civic players, human rights actors in many circumstances, they push the human rights agenda despite the limitations. So I think that's where the willpower, the desire to see it, probably some other people may call it metaism because they are sacrificing themselves. But I think it's about the desire to serve the community, the country, the family, my friends, and all, yeah. So I think that's where the resilience comes from.
Okay. So I'm sure now we are about to get to the close of our show, so I'll just get parting shots from each one of you, and then I think we part with the audience.
I think, like I said earlier on, if we try to look at the state of civil society organizations, it speaks of a house that is on fire, that is burning. We really need to come together as non-state actors. And I think we appreciate some of the efforts that have happened within the space of civil society, where different networks and types of coalitions have tried to engage with different actors, including the executive, around how we can try to create an environment that is more enabling for civil society organizations. And I think from where we stand as civil society organizations in Zimbabwe, we need civil society organizations today more than ever. We need them tomorrow more than ever. And we need a civic space that allows for all of us in our diversity as Zimbabweans to be able to exercise our rights freely. This is the beauty of the 2013 Constitution. We all went to a referendum. I think the majority said yes, and we are now all governed and guided by the values, by the dictates, and the provisions of the Constitution. And clearly, even in its current state, the Constitution still calls for the exercise of these freedoms fully towards the Zimbabwe that is envisioned through our Constitution.
Okay. Sam, your parting shot.
Yeah, I think there's need to have that balance where the civic actors and the government need to come together in order to ensure we embrace the Istanbul principles and also the 2013 Constitution, especially on the operation of NGOs and civic society organizations. And I think the question is, we need to be proactive in order to bring about the special goods and services that the people want through civic engagement and civic processes. So I think there's an opportunity for us to speak more, to talk more, to listen more to the community and build a civic society organizations that we want.
Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, this was Into Zimbabwe, an edition brought to you by Protect Defenders or Zimbabwe Human Rights Matters platform in partnership with the National Association of Youth Organizations. And today, I was joined by MacDonald Munyoro and Samuel Gwenzi, respectively as the male manager of NIO and the director of Protect Defenders. My name is Liam Kanenga, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you.